Okay, so we are live with the Node.js release working group meeting on the 12th of March 2020. And we'll start by following the agenda that is in the Node.js release repo issue 546. But just to start, are there any announcements anyone wants to make? No? Okay, the first item on the agenda is the working out a policy around reverts for LTS branches. I vaguely remember us discussing this last meeting. I can't specifically remember the actions we took from that. Does anyone else?
I don't think that we had specific actions. If I recall, I don't think that we necessarily even had like consensus on exactly what would make sense. I think it was one of those things that were like, it would be a case-by-case basis. But that like, perhaps we should be quicker to revert. I think the biggest inconsistency there that we didn't have like total consensus on, at least I don't necessarily 100% agree with, was the question about like, hey, if something breaks that lands on LTS, should it get reverted on master and then have that reversion kind of bubble down, or should it be reverted just on the release that broke? So an example of this would be something lands on current that has a breaking change but isn't noticed. That bug then gets to LTS and the bug is discovered while it's in LTS. Now, do we revert from master and then revert on current and LTS? Or do we revert only from LTS and then land again at the point that it's been fixed on current? Historically, I have done the latter, and I believe Anna was asking for something closer to the former. And I think there's cases where that may make sense, especially for like bigger breaks that don't have clear solutions to them. But in some cases, like the large pages change, for example, that landed on the recent 12 that we ended up reverting, it's a lot hairier to revert something that's like semver minor that's lived on master for a while. So I kind of feel like we need to take this case by case.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know if the kind of expectation around LTS releases and all of the enterprises using them in production may even add to us wanting to get an LTS release out as fast as possible. And that may involve just creating the proposal with the fix in it rather than waiting on master.
Yeah, I agree. I think that perhaps where this makes the most sense is just kind of waiting until the next time that we have this. Next time we hit a reversion, a bug, and then like kind of deciding in the moment like what makes the most sense. I think another possibility I think we discussed last time was potentially documenting like what to do if you've released a bug, and just kind of have a document that outlines a couple different playbooks, and having the revert from master be one of the potential playbooks. I think like Anna's concerns were like, one was that it can make it harder to keep track of what actually needs to be backported if we just kind of revert it and it gets left. And another one was that like, hey, if it's broken on LTS and it's still broken on current, then like maybe we shouldn't be having it on current at all. So maybe documenting the ways of handling problems could be a solution to this as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think having a what to do when there's a broken release guide somewhere, maybe in Node.js release, would be really useful actually. And maybe it could involve, hey, we should open an issue on the release repo just so all the other releases kind of know what's going on, that there was a broken release, and maybe even help out if there was people were stuck for time or something like that to jump in and fix, and we can all come to a kind of collective agreement on the approach.
Michael's saying in the chat also that he thinks maybe Anna meant that we should also try to revert on master much sooner. And I absolutely agree with that. We had an 11 release that went out this week. Well, like, I guess today. It went out at 11:59 p.m. East Coast time, so I'm calling it yesterday. But there was a PR that landed on Current that for streams that ended up breaking a whole bunch of things. And I believe that we got all the patches in to fix it. But there was a discussion about whether or not we should just revert that change. For what it's worth, the reason I didn't move forward with just reverting it was because of the other changes that landed on top of it, including a whole bunch of other streams backports for unrelated fixes. Just reverting it would have been like a huge tangled mess. And big shout out to Ronag for working kind of overtime the last couple days to get all those changes in. But I absolutely agree with what Michael's saying here, that like, you know, when things break on Current, perhaps we should be more aggressively reverting them earlier. And I'm absolutely on board with that.
Agreed. Okay, so I guess we can summarize this in the issue and remove from the agenda for next week.
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So that was everything that was tagged for the agenda, but I'll just go to the recent issues in Node.js release. So the first one, top of the list, was nominating Richard Lau for the LTS and backporters team. So
+1.
And also auditing the current list of LTS members. So that list is quite lengthy at the moment, and we're not really sure it's truly representative of people who still want to continue to be involved. So Myles, I saw you kicked off an audit for that. And also we had some discussions around, this should probably have been on the agenda actually, dropping the backporters team and kind of moving it up into the LTS team. I think, Myles, your suggestion was that we would have a release working group members team, which is everyone who's in the working group, a release automation team, so that would take care of the release tools like changelog maker, branch diff, etc. Releases, and that would be anyone who can promote a release, and LTS, which would be focused around LTS related work. That would probably include backporting to LTS. And if you were a member of both release and LTS, you would be doing the LTS, you could promote an LTS release. Is that correct, Myles?
That was just kind of what I threw out there. Happy to have something that's also like simpler. So for example, maybe we're okay with all of the release team members having access to all of the tools, and release automation doesn't need to be its own separate thing. But I was just trying to look at the structure that we had right now and the things that we're overseeing, and trying to, the most important thing that I was trying to capture was that we do have people, not a ton, but we do have people right now that are not doing releases but are helping with backports, and have, by our current model, permission to do so. And I would like for us to continue this structure. I think one of the things that's maybe a bit of a challenge here is trying to mix the mental model of like IAM, which is specific for permissions, as opposed to like working streams, which is like how we work. So perhaps we don't even need as many distinctions if we're okay with having slightly broader access control. But I was trying to find the balance there of like, what are the actual working streams and ways we collaborate along with like the permissions to our resources that we need to manage.
Yeah, one thing, there are many collaborators that regularly backport changes, and having those people who regularly do that have permission to actually land on the staging branches might be a good thing, rather than having to wait for one of us.
I half agree. In the sense that I definitely want to see more people doing the work. And maybe there's a way in which we can document that, like if n number of backporters approve something, it can land. And actually, this is maybe a good thing for us to poke at in general, is like, we haven't really used the general collaboration guidelines for landing, that those don't really apply to backports. And I'd have to dig through our governance again, both in the project and in LTS. I don't know if we really have super well documented policy around like when a backport can land. We've actually had like stronger policy around like who can land the backports. And since that group is really small, they can kind of land it whatever because we trust their judgment. So I do think that like if we wanted to, like another approach could be allowing anyone to land, but like requiring that someone from LTS signed off on it. That could kind of invert that relationship and allow anyone to land things on an LTS branch. But the only challenge to that could be that like those LTS branches can get rebased, they can get force pushed. They're a lot more like ephemeral than any of the other branches that we use in Node. So I'm not saying what we should do, but just like the calculus is different in how we figure out to like distribute the usage of those branches.
Yeah, because I guess the way we've worked is we've often told people when they're landing, well, told each other or kept each other up to date when we're landing things on the staging branches, just so we don't accidentally kind of push over someone's changes if we've had to back something out.
Exactly, and because we've kept that group kind of smaller, for better or for worse, it does create a bottleneck, but it also allows us to more closely manage that work and be a little bit more cowboy, for lack of a better term, about how we handle that branch, because we really just see it as like a working branch as opposed to a source of truth. Not to put people on the spot, but Richard and Shelley, as individuals who have either A, not been like releasing as long, or aren't a releaser, but have contributed to these branches, do you have any feedback or thoughts about how it's managed? Are there ways that you think we could manage it slightly better, or maybe, you know, remove some of the bottlenecks from our process?
I don't think we have the problem that we have lots and lots of backports that would sort of land so often that it would interfere with the any potential sort of backouts of staging or need to rebase staging. I think if anything, the issue is that we don't get enough backports for things that we actually want on LTS. I mean, for example, 10, I think we've got to the stage where we're not backporting anything unless people are asking for it. So I don't know, really, in terms of, you know, the risk of landing something and then losing it in a rebase, I guess it exists, but it's not like we're continuously landing things on the staging branch. Even if we did open it up, I don't think that would be the case.
I would say like the only bottleneck that I really see occasionally is that I think this is like more potentially like a cultural project thing than anything else, but sometimes it takes a long time for things that like do need to get backported because like the onus ends up depending on the PR falling on the backporters who don't necessarily have context in the PR and what it would take to backport it. So I think like if there's any way we can like poke at policy or people or whatever to see if we can sort of like create more of like an end-to-end, like the person who opens the original PR is a little bit more responsible for the backport to whatever staging branch we want it to get on, that might improve things a little bit.
So historically, there's a conversation that we had in the past and tried to bring up with the broader collaboratorship before about changing the definition of done. And Shelley, it seems to me like maybe you are talking about this to an extent. So we've tried a couple different approaches to this that haven't landed, but you know, currently for a lot of collaborators or a lot of people who are committing, even if it's drive-by, the definition of done is like the commit lands on master, and that's kind of when they walk away. And perhaps, and I think Shelley, you were talking about some automation tools that Electron uses, like we could give people some sort of signal about, you know, what branches things land cleanly on. That could be automated so that like that triggers them to think a little bit more about where they want it to live. So really, you know, expanding on that, you know, if you fix a bug on master because you found a bug on node 13, but you didn't actually ensure that your fix works on node 13, did you really fix the bug?
So this is actually a great question because a piece of tooling that we have, which I think would be relatively non-invasive, is that when you open a PR and you tag it with certain labels, Electron will automatically tell you all the branches it lands cleanly on without actually taking any pull request action or anything. It just shows up as a check.
I wonder if using the git node land tool, and the git node land tool, its last output being, hey, it landed cleanly on master, but we've just tried to cherry pick it to LTS branches. FYI, it doesn't land cleanly and will require a backport. I wonder if that would be a good way of getting the information out.
I think potentially. Oh, go for it, Myles.
No, please, Shelley.
I think like potentially, yes. I think like the value of showing it as a check on a PR though is that it's like very visible information and it doesn't actually require any like human lag time of trying to cherry pick it themselves. So I think like a person is, I would, you know, feel free to correct me or disagree, but like that somebody is much more likely to take ownership of backward if they can see from the moment they've like basically opened a PR to master that it won't go cleanly on XY branch.
Okay, and then maybe they could be required to add the label "don't land on 10" for that CI check too.
Yeah,
and then that could be as part of our regular CI.
I'm happy to find an example of something on Electron, but like the exact tooling we have is literally just that it tells you if a backport fails. I mean, it does other stuff too, but like you could stop it there.
I think that might be an interesting thing to try.
Yeah, I'm actually genuinely very happy to like port at least like the simple aspects of that tooling. Here's a good PR. Please don't mind the fact that a bunch of the CI is currently failing. But if you look down at the checks, you can see that in the checks panel, you can see backportable 8xy completed failed, and then backportable 9xy successful clean backport.
I think as far as checks go, we might need to consider the sort of the optics for people, especially if they're drive-by contributors. It's much easier to say things can land if all the checks are passing, but if we have any checks that we know might fail because, for example, they don't land on an earlier release branch, if that marks the PR red before it lands, then I can foresee lots of questions asking, how do I fix this? You know.
Yeah, so I agree actually. If you look at the PR that I linked, it's neutral when it fails. It doesn't go red. We did that on purpose for that reason.
Yeah. Because we've got some things in the existing CI, like the one that checks the commit message, but that was in Travis, and that's now not showing up in the checks API because whenever it went red, it was kind of decided that that wasn't something we wanted to concern the authors of the PR with. It was more kind of the person landing it, and it was that red mark and amongst all the other check indicators that was deemed to be an issue.
So I think that something like this could maybe be shown to folks through labels, for example.
Yeah.
So we already have a label system that's pretty accurate here. There's the backport requested label, and there's the LTS watch label. And we already have a bot that applies labels that, Shelley, if you wanted to, like, you could work this as a pull request against the node bot, because like all the infrastructure is already there. So you could just kind of hook into that.
But it doesn't need to be the node bot, right? It could be a GitHub action.
Oh, it could be anything. It definitely could. That's a good point, Richard. The thought I had though is like, try to land it. If it lands cleanly, add the LTS labels and maybe a comment, but it doesn't even need to be a comment. If it doesn't land cleanly, then add the backport requested label. That would prompt folks to then, if they don't think it should land, replace that label with a do not land label, or alternatively prompt them to consider making backport PRs. But the labels, I think, would maybe work a lot nicer than like an X or a check, because we're not talking about its eligibility to land on master. It also could come with like a comment, like essentially auditing the step that we do when we're automating the step of auditing, more or less. Because it would immediately ping people when they open the PR, hey, should this be on those branches? And kind of put that onus on the folks who wrote it, because most times, you know, we don't know if something should land. We're deferring to the folks who did it. The things that we decide maybe shouldn't land are the ones that, you know, introduced bugs or whatnot. So like, I guess the only thing that may be less than ideal with this approach is we don't want too many premature backports being opened. And I guess one of the things that could be less than ideal is like if we have things that we haven't landed yet that do backport cleanly, this would maybe prematurely tell folks that things don't land cleanly. I know that Joyi had that tool that can kind of trace the lineage of a PR to like say which other PRs would be blocking it. So like, I guess the one concern I would have with this tool kind of running at time that the PR is open is that there might be false negatives that are only false because we haven't backported other things yet.
So that's actually not 100% the way it works right now. It's opt-in right now, which means that you have to add the label yourself to check that to trigger the check to see if it'll backport.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So
I mean,
like,
we could trigger that on, say, the author ready label.
yeah,
which is
exactly.
supposed to be the we think this is ready, barring the CI passing, etc.
Yeah. So like anything like that, like I think that there's definitely like a ton of room for figuring out like when we want to trigger those kinds of checks and what kind of information we want them to surface. But I think that like that would definitely sort of like remove a lot of extra work from us of like having to audit a bunch of stuff ourselves. That could just be like showing up in a check that says like, here's the failed diff, it failed.
I guess the only thing is if a change could land cleanly, sometimes we don't want it to land at all. I know we will still be landing it manually, but I guess if we add the backport requested label, or the bot adds it without anyone from LTS looking at it, then it's an indication to the author that it will go through and it will eventually land on LTS, and they could put some effort into a backport for us to then look at it and say, hey, we really don't think this change should land on 10 or 12 or a previous release line. So functionally, they could raise the backport, but then we would disagree afterwards. We wouldn't want to waste their time if the release team thinks the PR is too dangerous to land.
So that could just be part of the workflow as to when we actually trigger the check, instead of automatically doing it. It could be that maybe somebody from the the LTS or release team would put the label on to say, check this, and then the automation would go off and decide whether it backports or not. And at that point, whoever put the label on is basically said, we think this is backportable. I guess the question then is there any chance that we would only allow it to backport to say into 12 but not 10? That's a more nuanced discussion. But then I guess we always have the don't land labels, so we could set the don't land labels and then trigger the check. So there's ways, yeah, it's basically discussion as to what we think should happen. I don't see that being a blocker, but it's just working out the flow.
Yeah.
I guess then a good follow-up question is like, out of the gate, do you think it'd be worth it for me to spend like a little bit of time just like spinning up a proof of concept for this?
Yeah, I also think maybe we should spin up an issue on release and maybe even a PR so we can comment on it, describing the flow of like when a label would be added, when the check would run.
Sure.
etc.
Definitely. I can do both if that's helpful.
Sounds good. Cool. So that conversation kind of started with the should we split out the team structure a bit differently in release? I'm not sure we've answered that specifically. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that, or would they prefer to just jump into the issue?
I think the only thing I'd say on that one was, I guess it's back to Myles' question about the sort of access management versus we have a team because it groups people together. So, for example, when people ping the LTS team in core, it's more, sometimes it's a question about when things will go into a release, and then sometimes it's a question of whether things would go back at all. And the question then is, is that a discussion that needs to happen amongst people that have the access rights to land things and branches, or is that we have a group that's wider than that would be able to respond to those pings, basically making decisions. And it comes back to what we want the group to be able to do. Do we want to make it easier for people to join the group, but not necessarily be landing backports or making releases? So, for example, do you have to do one of those two things in order to be an active participant in this working group, or is it that the working group is only for people that land things in the staging branches for the releases, or doing the releases themselves?
I think speaking directly to that, Richard, though, like that was the purpose of having release members and then having kind of all of these roll up into release. Yeah. So that the idea was that like the working group as a whole should be kind of anyone who wants to participate and contribute to this work. I'm going to call someone else who's on this call just as an example. We've got Darcy here from the NPM team, who has a vested interest in releasing the Node.js project, but is in a senior role at that organization, probably has limited time and maybe not able to personally volunteer. I won't speak for Darcy, even though I'm calling him out. Sorry, Darcy. But I think that it's important to be able to have the room for the folks. Darcy says correct and lol. But I think it's important to have the room for folks like Darcy to participate, to be here, to be in these meetings, to feel engaged, to feel like they're a part of this group. And so like, I imagine that release ends up becoming an umbrella where like anyone can be a member of release members that wants to show up and participate. And then kind of these other groups end up just being kind of groups we use to manage IAM. So I would also similarly expect that maybe the real thing to do here is just have release and these other subgroups and not even have release members if we're trying to not like over engineer the membership structure here, and have those subgroups just be how we manage the IAM, but not really have anything to do too much with membership. I think maybe the other thing that we need to figure out if we distinguish, like a difference between release and LTS. Historically, this group was called LTS, not release. And ended up, we changed the name to release because we realized it didn't really make sense anymore. To the other point that Richard was raising about kind of the names in the groups, I would kind of imagine though that like if we had a group called LTS, that anyone who was a part of that group would in theory be involved enough to have permission, especially if we made release a broader thing that anyone can be involved in, and LTS would be a portion of the responsibility of release. But I'm definitely already overthinking this, and very open and amenable to a simpler approach.
I mean, I think especially for release in particular, I can see there being a group of vested people that would be interested in things going into release, but not necessarily doing the releases. I don't know if that makes sense. Like, so people that might want to monitor discussions about things that potentially go into LTS releases and might have a valid opinion as to whether something should or should not go in, based on the stability criteria. But, I mean, having permissions to, even in that stuff we were talking right at the beginning about landing backports, that is a bar to entry, because that kind of implies you have to be a collaborator to start with in order to make code changes to core. Whereas, I do think we can open up discussions about whether things should land or not in a particular release line to, as many people as want to participate.
So I guess then maybe the difference here then would be, like this sounds like a consensus problem more so than anything else. And historically, I guess, for lack of a better way of framing it, LTS has kind of operated as like a BDFL model with like a handful of benevolent dictators, as opposed to like consensus seeking in the same way that things work. I guess we still do reach consensus between the smaller group of collaborators though. But sorry, my brain is connected directly to my mouth, so apologize for the word vomit. But I guess like part of what I'm thinking about right now is like, is there even value at this point anymore in distinguishing between release and LTS? And perhaps what we want is actually to keep backporters, or keep some sort of idea of the permission of like who gets to land the thing. Okay, I'm stepping back for a second. I think there's two different things that I'm talking about at the same time. There's who has permission to land the things on the branches, and who gets to make the decisions about what lands. And I think, Richard, maybe to what you're talking about is we want to encourage other people to be able to participate in the decision-making process. But I guess here is where like maybe things get a little tricky, is that like the understanding and decision-making about what lands on an LTS branch does require a lot of context. So I guess what I'm trying to work my head around here is like, how do we keep this open and allow there to be discussion? Darcy mentions DEP updates here, for example, but like, how do we make it feel, or make it be, not just feel, that the discussions are open, while we still have a smaller group of people who eventually make the decision? Because that isn't really consensus, but maybe it is if we're just saying that like anyone can object and there's a larger group, then like, those who have a little bit more understanding may object. But the flip side would be is like, if we made, if the current group of people who are part of the LTS team made a decision about what lands on an LTS branch, I mean, historically, I guess we haven't had too many people object to that, but like as it is set up right now, other members of release at large wouldn't really be able to object to those decisions. So maybe at the core of what we're trying to figure out here is like, what is the decision-making model? And especially, I think, since when we're auditing and creating an LTS branch, and maybe Shelley and Beth can speak more directly to this, we really are kind of acting like benevolent to the branch at the time that we're doing it. We're not really asking permission of other people. We're putting together what we think to be right, and then like we publish the proposal. Now, I guess it is consensus in the sake that the proposal is open, and if anyone has problems with any of the commits that are in there, they can raise them, and for the most part, it's pretty non-controversial. But to me, I guess I would want to figure out, like, Richard, it seems like you're asking for a way to make people feel more empowered as part of the decision-making process. which I am all for, but I want to figure out a way that we do that without hurting the velocity that we currently have, because we arguably already have a velocity problem. And I'm assuming that you want to improve velocity with these changes, because, you know, that's what we all want to see happen.
Yeah, no, to be honest, I'm a little bit, I guess, looking at it from a sort of more personal lens, whereas, you know, it's great that I now have that nomination to join the backporters team, but up until now, I haven't had that. And yet I have been more or less responding to LTS pings in core. So from that respect, you know, I have been participating in LTS discussions, even though technically speaking, I do not have currently any powers to land anything on either the staging branches or to make releases. So I don't know, maybe there aren't that many people in my situation, but then given the number of people in the current LTS group that aren't releasing, I guess the question is, why did they join that group in the first place? Because, you know, that was a, you know, by invitation, people volunteered to join that group. They weren't just thrown into it. And, you know, people that circumstances may have changed now that they're happy to be removed from that group, but, you know, the majority of the LTS group aren't releases.
Yeah, there's kind of two bits there that are historical that I think are interesting context here. One is, since release was originally LTS, not release,
yeah,
a lot of the members of that group are kind of holdovers from that. So when LTS was actually like the group that was discussing and designing the release process, but not necessarily doing the work. The other historical bit that I think, and maybe there's a better way to document this, or a better way to empower folks, and maybe that's something, you know, I personally could be doing a better job on of Drop the Ball with. Fun historical fact, the release working group was not chartered. The LTS team was a team for the longest time, and in theory had not been given any permission to do any of the work that it was doing. And we just kind of like created the process and respected it, and have slowly onboarded people who have also kind of carried that torch of the process. But it was only, I think, in the last year and a half, maybe 2 years, that it actually got formalized as a working group. So Richard, the parallel that I see there is like impact without authority has kind of historically been how this group has operated. So if for better or for worse, the pattern that you've identified here, that yourself have kind of been doing the work but didn't really have the authority or permission to do it, is very much the way this group has kind of operated historically, and then only kind of been like, oh yeah, maybe we should have like the permission to do that, and correcting that afterwards. Very much fits the pattern of this group, which may not be a good thing, but I just thought that would be like a fun historical note to share.
Fair enough. I mean, it might be that the discussion we're having on Moot anyway, because it relies on people volunteering to join the group, and I think that's been a challenge, not just for this working group, to get people to volunteer, and part of that is the, you know, barrier to entry, and, you know, for good reason, we don't want to let anyone just start doing releases. But on the other hand, there needs to be a way to sort of ease them into the group. But yeah, it's, you know, it's a good discussion, whatever we end up doing.
It seems to me like we're probably not going to come up with the best structure today and be able to point to it and say this is what we're going to do. So maybe jumping in on the issue with more suggestions, and we'll review again in a couple of weeks, or maybe the meeting after next.
I'm good with that.
Yeah. Okay, I will add some note based on our conversation to the minutes, as people may wish to comment on those. I'll just hop back to the other issues. So those were the kind of three at the top of our list. I did raise an issue for creating offboarding documentation /policy. This is when Jeremiah left and we realized we didn't actually have the process documented. So that's an issue that we should probably take a look at some point. It should be relatively straightforward. It should just be the inverse of the onboarding document, if we have one of those, which I'm not sure we do. And in terms of other issues, don't think there's anything new. One thing I'll kind of mention is, I don't know if anyone's seen, but Node Core Utils has an option for landing backports. So you can do git node land -- backport and it will automatically insert the backport PR URL. People feel free to play with that to try and land backports, because then if there are any bugs, because it's quite a new feature, we will see them. And I think, Shelley, I don't know if you want to summarize the work you've been doing on the, is it still in Node Core Utils around the create release?
Oh, yes. I was actually going to follow up with that, so thanks for that. Yeah, so I found some time a little bit recently and opened up a PR that handles the preparation step for releases in like a more automated fashion. It works in like a pretty similar way as a lot of Node Core Util stuff does, where it's like it prompts you and like asks for your confirmation for certain things, but otherwise like abstracts away most bits of releasing, like, or the preparation step, like creating the changelog automatically and a few other things. So I would love some more eyes on that, because I would love to get it landed sooner over later. And then also I would love some more dog fooding if y'all are willing, just to like play around with it, see if there's any bits of the flow that could be more intuitive or done a slightly different way, et cetera, et cetera. I will throw the link to that actually.
Awesome.
Yeah. Here.
It looks really good. I'll aim to try it out with the next release that I prepare. Try and give it a go.
The only part of it right now that's like not 100% working, well, not working, I guess, but it's like the changelog doesn't, or changelog maker doesn't really have a great option for formatting notable changes in like a plain text way. So it's a little bit difficult right now to automate creating the release commit beyond making it like a little more markdowny than I think we want. But I also think that's probably not necessarily a blocker. Like, I think maybe that could just be something that can be changed in changelog maker or something.
Absolutely not a blocker. And I think that that's totally, like, we're already 90% of the way there better than it was before. I wouldn't block on that. And I think any one of the people who are doing releases will be ecstatic to not even, like, honestly, the step I would do would be to copy the markdown into the release commit and then format it in the release commit. So I think it's absolutely fine to start with that. And then if we want to make a changelog maker, like release commit formatter, we can do that in changelog maker and then update Node Core Util afterwards.
Cool. Yeah, in that sense, like, please, I mean, feel free to, you know, review it. And like, it's definitely like, if, like I said, it follows Node Core Util format, but it's definitely like, if there's things you find like annoying or like could be more or less, require more or less like human confirmation and prompting, like, please feel free to input.
Awesome. I'll give it a try. And yeah, so I think we've covered it. We covered everything on the agenda and had some good discussions. I'm just looking at the release schedule just to overview. The next release is due next week for 13, so probably 13/12 next week, and Ruben's got his name against that one. And for Node 12, where are we?
That RC is next week, I believe. It's me.
Yep.
I believe the RC is the 17th.
Yes, same day, Tuesday. Yep. And that's a patch release. Yeah. And for 10, oh, this is probably something worth mentioning. The last Semver minor of 10, the release date is put for the 17th. The proposal PR is open. And I think it's got pretty much everything that's going to go out with it in there. It's only like 35 commits, but it'd probably be the last chance to get new features. So if there's anything anyone in this team thinks is missing, please let me know. And I think there's only one open backport PR that could potentially land, and that's the large pages one, which I know we've reached out to Gabriel to discuss about whether that should land. Cool. Okay, so anything else anyone wants to mention or bring up today?
I think I should probably mention from the build working group perspective, I think we're ready to start rolling out notarization for Catalina for macOS 10.15. So I think Rod is aiming for the next 13 releases, the one for next week, to be the first release that would build on the new 10.15 Macs we have on the release CI. So the plan would be to put that out in current, and then, you know, when we're happy with that, looks okay, to then pull it back into the earlier releases after it's had a chance to bake.
I think
Yeah.
Rob also mentioned on that one, it would be worth adding a note to the changelog saying we have changed the machines that we're building on for Mac due to the notarization. But we have,
because we have had to bump the, in order to do the notarization, we need to release on a newer Mac. I think the current releases are on 10.11 of macOS, and we've had to bump to at least 10.14. So we've got 10.15 in the release CI, and that will be the new release machine. But we're rolling that out gradually. So 13 will be first.
But we're still using the same Xcode targets, so we don't expect anything to be too broken. But we should add a note to the blog that we put out just in case there is any unexpected side effects. Okay, anything else for anyone to mention today? I think there's no. I'll end the meeting here. Thanks for joining, everyone. Speak to you later.
Bye.
Cheers.